Thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about climate crisis in general, and specifically the affected victim in Pakistan and in Nigeria, two countries who are affected by climate-driven floods and rain. And the first question that I'm going to ask, and this question is probably for Maggie, if we start with you, Maggie, what is futures literacy and why do we need it for anticipating the climate crisis specifically?
Thank you for that question. Futures literacy is building up a muscle, really, if you will, about thinking about the future. And it builds an awareness about assumptions. It builds an awareness about used futures, which means ideas that the future come from someone else. And it's like a hand-me-down future. So futures literacy is shifting from focusing on the past as all of the data points, all of the inspiration, all of the, I guess, frustration that the future will look like the past, and putting futures literacy is adding a little bit of a above and beyond. Yes, and we've got this information. There's information that we don't have yet. Here's some ways of thinking about it and changing your mindset to get that information.
Ziyan, I will like you to talk about how do you scan for signals, emerging issues, and emerging trends. Emerging trends are very important for futurists. So how do you scan for it? Especially if you can give some references to climate crisis, I will really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question and thanks for having us here. Very nice to be here. When it comes to scanning for signals, trends, and drivers, especially when it comes to a climate lens, we use a variety of approaches, and it depends on the nature of the inquiry and the scope of the outcomes we're looking to impact. And usually we'll have a multitude of sources that would map to various steep V factors. So looking across arenas of social, tech, economic, environmental, political, and value-based. And sometimes we'll include realms of art, healthcare, legal, depending on the arena we're playing in. And we look at a multitude of sources. We look at peer-reviewed journals, we look at news articles, we look at online forums. We try to get up-to-minute information. So social media is sometimes very helpful as well. And then we like to compare and contrast with deeper research about looking at things like op-eds, looking at commentary and trying to parse what second and third order implications might be, looking at the stakeholders and ecosystems that exist. And then we try to look at directionality of trends as well. Is something increasing, decreasing? Is it remaining unaffected? So there are a variety of ways we can look at it. And when it comes to climate change, there are a number of metrics and values that can help provide indicators. So looking at the degree of displacement, climate immigration statistics, looking at landmass and erosion stats. A lot of data is available right now from satellites, seismic data. We have so much information about our Earth today, and I think it's a question about getting our scientists to talk to each other and getting that information to spread properly.
Angela, my question to you is that Ziyan spoke about the trends and values as well. And we are talking about creating an equitable world. And in this climate crisis, our Prime Minister went to COP27 and he said that our carbon dioxide emission is less than 1%. And yet, because of this climate crisis, which is created by the global north, due to their industrialization, they have emitted so much carbon that is impacting us in a way that it is unmanageable for us. So it's a question of value, of equitability. I was wondering if you could help us out a little bit and talk about this equitability aspect of climate crisis.
Yes, and again, I'd just like to echo just to say thank you for inviting us here today as well, and also just to offer my condolences for the families that have lost their lives and their livelihood. So my heart goes out to them in the flood. So, you know, and I think just on the back of that, when we talk, very often when we talk about the climate crisis, we talk about in the context of future generations. We need to do we need to do these things for future generations. But I think, and that sentiment really comes from many of the Western countries. But I think if you look at the global South, that future is actually now, right? If we look at the floods in Pakistan, you know, the people that have unfortunately died and the people that are affected literally is the entire country of Canada. We only have, like, I think we've just reached 37 million people, or 36 million. So sometimes you have to put it into that context where the West has to think about, well, what would happen if the entire population of Canada perished in that way? And I think from my perspective, a lot of it does come from that push when we're talking about climate change. The solutions are predominantly coming from the West. And I think the global South really needs to have more of a voice, and there needs to be more respect for those living in that part of the world. And I think that piece of it hasn't quite happened. It's been given lots of lip service, but I don't think it's there yet. But that really does come down to, if we sort of dig a little bit deeper and we go back to colonialism, this is, the way that I see it, this is colonial environmentalism in that sense, where the West is still thinking about how they can solve this crisis, but really it's based on a commercial or a productive stance, and not one of reciprocity, not one of respect, not one of looking at relationships between the global South and the North, not one that's looking at responsibility, etc. And I think those need to be at the core. So when we talk about futures, if we can look at those being at the core of how we move forward, I think we'd start to see perhaps more of a shift, and not look at it so much as, it's almost like climate colonialism, if I could put it that way.
Okay, thank you so much, Angela. And I guess your point about climate colonialism will resonate with a lot of people living in global South, because that's how we feel. We don't have much in terms of our pollution that we have created. It was created by the West, and now we are suffering it. And I'm not right now the situation is such that we need food. And in COP27, it was principally accepted that there should be climate justice. And these vulnerable countries, these affected countries, specifically this year, what happened to Pakistan and Nigeria, they should be compensated, they should be supported. Yet we don't know when this aid is going to come. And it is like telling a hungry person that it's okay, might as well wait for 3 or 4 more months, and then you might have food. So have hope for it. So it is a difficult situation. And that brings me to my another question, and that is related to Futures Literacy Lab. If, Maggie, if you have to create a Futures Literacy Lab for these victims of climate change, how would you design it? Because this is what I have to do, and that's why I need your help.
Oh my goodness. I don't know that I would be able to, from my perspective, give you a lot of advice. I'm personally not positioned and professionally not positioned, and culturally don't have the background to know your context without spending time to understand it from your perspective. And we've talked before about sort of thinking about the future is a luxury. as you're talking about reading, you have to be able to have the right environment within which to absorb that information, process it, remember it, you've weight it that it's more important than other things that are going on. So to construct a lab in a formal process in what I understand the Futures Literacy Labs to do, that Riel Miller has created, and the whole organization together, it's very heavy mental work. And the first thing that you need to do, not you, but people need to do in order to think about something that is beyond their immediate needs, absolute immediate needs, is calm and security and some kind of stability and some kind of hope that they can get to the next level of looking beyond their immediate crisis. So a little bit of, I guess, grounding, if you will, in order to actually absorb what's going on in the immediate situation. And then after that, once you have some of the context, the beautiful list of things that Ziyan was talking about, of how you can look for emerging trends, how you might see drivers of change and so on, that access to additional information from additional sources is very, very, very difficult to get, care about, process, synthesize, make some sense of, look for some themes and so on, until you sort of have this immediate place. Beyond that, making sense of things, you sort of, or one has the capability after they've looked around and notice what's immediately available, have access, digest it and so on, then a next level of interpretation can be overlaid on top of that. So putting in some of the frameworks that take these mental concepts and stretching them and adding challenging questions, potential of things not going the way you want to, potential of dreaming, potential of thinking about how you might give input, finding a place in the future. So to go back to the beginning, we've got an immediate base that has to be established under your own terms, under your own understanding of what's critical. And our interpretation of what's critical is, as Angela has mentioned, and our ways, the global north ways of addressing immediate is commercial, tends to be commercial, tends not to have the time to understand how the context is totally different. And one simple example might be an iron deficiency. And there's an example of a company that spent a long time within Cambodia to understand the actual needs of iron deficiency, the source, and the solutions that are typical to the West. Give them iron pills, or give them citrus plus iron infused vegetables. Both of those things are not appropriate in some of those regions. So it took several tries, several attempts to understand what are the values in that region. And a product that came out of recognizing that area is called the lucky ironfish. And it's a little lump of iron that gets put into soup. And so it becomes something that is a part of the culture. So I hope that that sort of helps to give you a little bit of reflection on how much can be done, how fast it can be done, and how much different it needs to be from the tools, tips, and tricks and processes that are already in existence in futures literacy.
Perfect. So like when we're looking at futures literacy from the, especially if we're looking at the context of Pakistan, for example, and I think part of setting up a futures literacy initiative or lab is, I think, as Maggie was saying, to understand the context and realities of the region it's being set for, the mindsets and the culture, but then to look at different frames of time with futures literacy. And sometimes when you're dealing with a population where there might not be a lot of futures literacy to start with, to bring it down to the person, just to start thinking about personal futures, then moving outwards to think about family, friends, and then society. So like in the concentric stakeholder map, moving outwards, and then to think about things in terms of short, medium, and long term, to the point of start getting people to think about their personal futures later this day, then to think about what would you have to do tomorrow? Would you have to, how are you dealing with whether it's savings, food, then how do you deal with next week, next year? And we find even in very developed nations, people have challenges planning for their own futures, even for the next year. And then we see this problem escalate on an international context. And as you mentioned, it leads to an unequitable distribution sometimes of challenges. This is societal challenges, whether we're talking carbon emissions, factory wage rates, so many different variables. So I think to start to recognize the various needs, capabilities, and competencies of the people we're dealing with and planning futures for, and then challenging hierarchy and having representation, I think is really critical, to have people from all walks of society and all different roles have their needs be represented in the planning for futures literacy, to make sure that it's spread, because futures literacy is one of those things that if it's not distributed equitably and it's only concentrated in a certain sect of society, the problems of today keep perpetuating themselves.
That's true.
Yeah. And then to have a trauma-aware view as well, I think, to recognize whether it's being displacement from climate crisis, whether it's a host of cultural issues, conflict. Yeah. And I think just incorporating more cultural paradigms and views than the Western view. So I think Pupul Bish, she's a futurist who's looked at pluralism and foresight. I recommend looking into her work as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to just, unless you had another question for me, but I can just jump onto what Maggie and Ziyan said. I mean, I completely agree, and I read about that research, Maggie, about the ended up coming up with the iron fish, and it took them a while to actually realize that no, we actually need to look at a solution that is culturally appropriate, exactly. And that was the key. And just to sort of go back to what I was talking about before, where very often we look to the global north for solutions, and those solutions are often in our own backyard. And so we can look at indigenous knowledge, we can look at local cultural knowledge, and those are the things that I think, rather than look to the global north for those solutions, yes, we have some frameworks, yes, we have some systems and strategies that we could look at, but how can we reframe those for our own sort of cultural needs? And at OCAD University and the Strategic Foresight program that I head up, we have just launched which is called Strategic Foresight and Innovation, or SFI, and we have just launched Black SFI. And the reason we've done that is to look at how we can bring in our students, our Black students from different various backgrounds, work on local community issues. using, excuse me, using systems, using foresight. How can we do that? Because a lot of them are out in the world working, just doing their jobs, working with, doing systems and foresight thinking, etc. But now let's look at how we can bring that back to the community. And the way that we'll work, or they will work with that, is going to be completely different from how they work with it, perhaps in their day-to-day working.
Completely.
But again, as I was talking about, looking at that Indigenous knowledge with that respect and responsibility, reciprocation and relationship, I think these are really key, because I think without that, then you don't have human heart. And without human heart, we will never really solve this problem, because it will continue to be looked at as an economic solution, right? Instead of a human solution that we need to bring forth. And it was interesting in the COP26 that I believe was in Glasgow, they had Global South negotiator Diego Pachino Balance, I think his name was, and he basically said, and they were at that particular COP26, they were talking about net zero, and he basically said that the net zero is a new set of rules imposed by the West to create carbon colonialism, and that was his quote, and it's right, because essentially the market solution is the only solution that when the West talk about climate change and solving that really is the agenda, and we have to bring it back, because it's the developing economies that are really bearing the brunt, as you said, Dr. Shan.
To add a last point to this, I think, because very well said, Angela, by the way, I think is, and you touched upon this, is this idea of tying futures literacy to learning outcomes. So are we tying it to designing better products, the way we save, our approach to fiscal policy, our lifestyle, our mindsets and planning? And part of that, building on what Angela's saying about SFI, and because Lucky Ironfish has come up so much, coincidentally, they're a client of ours at OCAD Co, and we've been working with them on improving product design for future. And I think this importance of understanding what future are these people expecting, are we hoping to live, and looking at what our preferred futures are and what we're also hoping to avoid, and then to start designing goals for futures literacy around that as one potential starting point.
Okay, so Angela, the question about economy and getting help from Global North, and instead of getting their help, we should rely more on our own indigenous knowledge. But it seems that it's not working. Like, I mean, right now in Pakistan, we don't have any agency. Those people who are affected by climate change, they don't seem to have any agency at all. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to drinkable water. They don't have access to transportation, to communication. So they don't have any agency. And our government is declaring the same thing. They are saying the same thing. They don't have the agency. So if you don't have the agency, how do you implement any solution, even if it is your own, right? And this situation is created by the colonization of the Global North or the Western powers. Now, even they don't have sufficient resources to help all these vulnerable countries. We have been suffering for last 15-20 years, and so are other countries, and it is going to go on. It is not stopping, right? So maybe after a couple of years, we have another flood. So how do we, I mean, how even the Global North can support us? I mean, they wouldn't have enough funds. We have already been through COVID-19 that has affected a global economy. And now we are sitting here with these kind of crises coming into those countries which have nothing to do with the climate pollution. So to deal with this economic challenge, how do we go ahead and how do we mitigate this challenge that even Global North is not capable? They don't seem to have the agency. First of all, they don't seem to have the will, right? And even if they have the will, do they have sufficient resources? Then there is so much fighting among them whether we should pay for it or the emerging economies like China and India should also participate in it. Okay? So these kind of talks are going on, and COP26 also had some good news, but it did not translate into funding. The same thing has happened in COP27 too. So when you were talking about decolonization, do you think in 10 years from now we'll be more decolonized, especially climate colonization coming from the West, which is trying to tax carbon emission and decrease the growth of developing countries? Like for us in Pakistan, we have less than 1% carbon imprint, but for growth, for economic growth, we have to have more industries, and that will create more carbon. So this is a vicious cycle which is going to go on. So considering all that, where do you see the world 10 years from now, especially those countries which are colonized even in climate sense?
Well, that's an interesting way of framing it, because I think the way you've described it, you've touched upon what is very quintessential at its core, a wicked problem, right? Multi-variable, multi-stakeholder, multi-tension, where it's very difficult to often affect changes in any one place because you have so many competing variables and tensions. And a lot of the issues that you mentioned, right? Some of them may be scarcity issues, but a lot of them are allocation issues sometimes. And we're looking at issues of entrenched mindsets, of biases, of misinformation, of propaganda, of foreign policy goals and objectives that are often played out, years of misinformation from every single society present on Earth today. If we were to do tracebacks of communication tactics, practices, foreign policy, statecraft, and strategy, we'll see a lot of these trends echoing throughout civilization, throughout time, throughout history. Yet oftentimes there's a lot of name pointing and calling out of different societies, but we see this as being a human problem, whether we're talking corruption, greed, conflict. These are all inherently human issues that have existed across civilizations and societies from the dawn of time. And it's, I think, a big question about coming together and looking at cognitive biases, social biases, ego, empathy, and really looking at things from a distilling to a humanistic standpoint, and then starting to throw out certain destructive models, like what things like late stage capitalism and the effects, because there is no black and white in these areas. Everything is gray. And even with something like capitalism, you can't really denounce any one structure as right or wrong. It's not absolute, and it's very dependent on the context it's in. So I think there's a lot of work needing to happen, bringing multiple stakeholders from multiple levels of society, having these voices represented in ways that allow people to keep their agency and truth in stories. So there's a lot of talk about decolonization of data, decolonization of the way information is utilized, and even the way we refer to these things. Oftentimes there are extractive notions, value, use of data. There's an extractive connotation there. So even the languages that we use and the words need to be changed. So in 10 years, I can't tell you where exactly we'll be, but I can safely say it will either be collapse, growth, something to do with discipline. It could go, there's a number of different directions that we could go in, basically. And it depends on where your personal orientation is, your organization's orientation is in your society, because these things, like I said, are very gray and murky.
Yes, Maggie, please.
Yeah, what I would love to add to what Ziyan was saying and what you were saying as well, your questions are very, very, very broad. And with the questions like we and they and all of those things, I can understand the root of those questions. There are, by very nature, we have individuals have past, present, and future orientation. Some people always look to the past in terms of, well, I did this, I tried that, all of the efforts that I did were with great intention. And here we are. Some people are very, very, very focused on the present by their very nature. And that's, what can we do immediately? What's our capability now? Can't see the future, can't necessarily recognize it as anything different than today. And then there's future orientation, and these are mindsets, which is asking the question, well, what might the future be different? And that's sort of an internal drive. So, the human heart and human issues and so on that Angela and Ziyan have been talking about. There's a personal futures readiness that is part of the who might this who be and the they be. And you can look across society, and there are some people who are comfortable by their very personal nature to ask questions like, what if we didn't? Or how does this work in alternate governance structures? And it becomes a personal motivation, a personal value system, a personal way of entering into the world as a maverick, a change maker, someone who wants to see things at a systems level. And they may have a track record of doing this. So entering those people into a conversation may be more effective than just, anyone in a geographic region. It's sort of a mindset and capability. So it does come down to a small group in order to have to move the needle at all. Another thing that Ziyan picked up on the concept of the wicked problem, and these things are intractable, and meaning it's not solvable because there's too many forces at play. However, if you put a boundary or a scope on that question, what is something that we can do, either time-based or geographically based or resource-based, within our reach, it's possible to potentially find a leverage point for a little bit of change. And great, vast systemic shift change is obviously hard, and can be slow, or can be, crisis inducing, or as a result of crisis. And we've just seen some great examples of quick shifts based on ideas that were kind of, maybe under the radar before in the last couple of years. When we start looking at your, in your own backyard, and so on, perhaps there are governance models that are local. As an example, democracy is very much imported. Some of the other colonial forces, again, imported, imposed, solutionized. It takes a lot of inner reflection and understanding people's lived experiences. What do you know about how this happened in your family? Who is a leader in your family? Who is a leader in your community? And pulling together some of these personal understandings, personal lived experiences, to perhaps there's a thread of, thank you, what can we learn from that might change something on a little bit bigger of a scale? And there's so many examples of that and how it can trickle up, from the grassroots to impacting a larger population, having a larger conversation that gets to the level of South and North and East and West. However, I think finding those people is a game of patience. And the first people who step forward to say that they're interested in change making are champions. They may not be the leaders, but they, from a lab perspective, there may be a trickle out of to the people that have the resources to make the change. So what you're doing with your in your school, starting with first year students or undergrad students, you're catching them at a right time of life where mindsets are shifting. They're coming together and because life is so different from I guess being within a pre-university, pre-academic setting, that there are some questions and self-awareness that they can discover more deeply because of that sudden shift. So yeah, it's a mixing. Sorry, Ziyan, please go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. I was just
gonna-
going to say that
sorry.
plurality is so key there, right? And I think being able to recognize the validity of multiple viewpoints, of multiple ways of living, of multiple perspectives, and being able to respect and recognize that at the table and see that, oh, wow, we have multiple ways of viewing things, but yet multiple ways of doing things. And yet at a very human level, all our needs are very similar at a biological level, right? And to be able to start looking at things like that, because in every region of the world, we have a lot of wasteful infighting, even between, we love to draw lines in the sand as a civilization. Oh, you versus me, this versus this. We love to distinguish, differentiate, and put things into hierarchies and classifications and objects. But recognizing that a lot of our classifications are very surface level, and we really need to start putting differences aside in order to be able to come together meaningfully around these wicked problems and systemic issues.
Yeah, and I would add to that from Maggie's point there about we're looking at local, we're looking at national, we're looking at global, and to your point about what should happen now, because there are people that have no food, there's no communication, and these are very complex issues, right? And often they're competing. There's conflicting priorities as well with government, with people in need, and often looking at that immediate need is obviously the first thing that one needs to respond to. But I don't think there's a single person. I don't think there's a single skill. I don't think there's a single process that can meaningfully address these. It is a combination of interdisciplinarity, collaboration, that all of these things applied to the focus of the idea of trying to solve the climate issue and the impacts on the countries that bear the brunt of that, and that has to sort of go beyond business as usual, which a lot of these conferences, when they end, it just simply becomes business as usual. But we do need to tackle the complex issue at different scales, number one, so at different scales, and also with different lenses. And so to your point, Ziyan, yes, we have these sort of different ways of looking at things, but I think we could pull them together so that one lens doesn't become larger than the other. And I think that's what's happened in the past. So looking at how do we look at research? What kind of research should really be going on? Are we doing the right kinds of research? What sort of design methods are we using? What sort of planning, what sort of systems analysis is actually going on? And are we looking at it in the right way? What type of futures thinking, how do we bring all these things together? So not that we were going to solve the problem with this discussion, but I think there's a way in which we could maybe build a framework by, as Ziyan says, taking a little mix of different aspects and bringing those together. But at the center, we have to say, well, what is our intention in doing this? Is it to solve the climate crisis, or is it to prevent, people in Pakistan, Nigeria, and other places around the world from destroying their land mass and their economy and their livelihoods? Like, what is the intention? And I think right now the intention is too broad. And I think we need to narrow the intention, because if we narrow the intention, then it really becomes about people.
And there is another issue that came up during COP27. Greenpeace initiative said that they should focus on climate issue specifically, and instead of interconnecting it with human rights issues, for instance. They said that it's happening in Egypt and they have some human rights issues, but if we talk about it, one, we will dilute climate crisis issue. On the other hand, people from Greenpeace movement working in Egypt, their life will be endangered. So my question is that these sustainable development goals of United Nations, 17 of them, are they interconnected, or we can divorce them as well? Like, we can take and focus on climate change only and thinking that, well, human rights are separate and they don't have much to do with climate crisis.
A great question, because I think it's important, while they can be looked at as individual pieces, I think tying to our earlier discussion about systemic issues and wicked problems, there's deep interconnection woven between, and there's a lot of causality, there are dependencies there. There's a lot more linkage than is apparent at the surface.
Yes, please. Yeah, Maggie, Angela, please feel free.
I was okay. So that's actually a really good point by Greenpeace. It's definitely a strategy that I've used when working with social change issues. So many years ago, I was involved in the Free Nelson Mandela campaign when I was in the UK, and the anti-apartheid movement had been going for many, many years, 30, 40 years, until the point that I got involved in it. And at the time, there was lots of protests. There were many people involved from all races, pushing against the apartheid movement in South Africa. But what was happening? We had protests. We had artists and designers, designing protest posters. We had sanctions. There was a whole slew of anti-apartheid activity going on. But it wasn't until we decided that we actually had to focus, and that focus had to be on Nelson Mandela, because before that we were talking about all the political prisoners in South Africa and all those that had been exiled, right? But it was too big of an issue. And that's why when I talk about what is the intention, I'm really trying to get to, okay, is there one focus? Because what we ended up doing was focusing on Nelson Mandela, and that was the message, and that was the loudest message that we could make. And I think it could quite possibly be, as a strategy, could quite possibly be the same when we talk about the climate crisis. We have to find that one thing that we can push and push and push. And that became the lever of change. So if we talk about systems, and we talk about that system that holds everything together, and then we talk about what's that lever of change, and that became the lever of change, was that focus. And you could push all your energy into that one focus.
Maggie, if you want to add your input, please do that.
Thank you so much for that example. It's not one that I'm familiar with, and it's so poignant. what went through my mind was Occupy. What did Occupy establish or do? It did call the question, and the focus on Nelson Mandela. Yes, there's a lot of political prisoners and a lot of human rights issues that are being left behind with all of that energy and all of that singular focus. So the strategy must have had an inciting question that had a critical mass of, we want to answer this question to come to the one solution. So what Greenpeace has done is they've called the question, and it's an excellent provocation and a lightning rod. And perhaps within that, their global platform for conversation and long history of activations, that they will be open and willing, perhaps, to have conversations about, our question is critical, and we can be a lens or a framework or a guide as to how to keep that question into focus. And a convener outside of Greenpeace can help to coalesce all of the things that Angela and Ziyan have been talking about, to get to an intention that is going to go the distance.
Okay, so that brings me to probably the last question, which is about gender equality. And even in the time of climate crisis, what we have witnessed in Pakistan, that women have special challenges during this time too. Very simple ones, very necessary ones too, like women do not have toilets when they are without shelter on the ground in Sindh and Balochistan. Men can go out in the field, but women have problems. So gender plays a very significant part in creating different sort of challenges. How do you guys think these gender issues, how do you see these gender equitability, the possibility of gender equitability or equality in 10 years from now? Where do you see this issue?
I think either way the cards fall, I think it's critical for all of humanity to really start taking gender equity more seriously and really paying attention to all of the injustices around the world. Like, for example, there's a wonderful book that I recommend everyone who's listening and watching should check out. It's called Invisible Women. And it talks about how in most of our design decisions around us, whether we're talking crash test dummies for car, vehicle safety, design of switches, pens, equipment, are not designed with women in mind. That's half of the population of our world that's been left out of design decisions. So many unnecessary deaths, so many unnecessary conflicts and exclusions that take place. And ultimately, it winds up affecting men negatively by excluding women from these conversations. It affects society negatively. And it's important to start to recognize and move beyond old school archetypes of society, of gender, of hierarchy, and recognizing the importance of humanity and being able to give respect and dignity to all, and removing barriers for us all to move forward, whether we're looking at the basis of gender, race, whatever form of identity.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and I'm really glad you brought this issue up as well. You know, it very often puts women in a place of vulnerability, whether it's, you know, personal hygiene, as you said, it's childbearing, like how do you do that if your home's flooded and you're running for your life, and what sort of conditions are your children born into? Very often, if you've lost your partner, then, you know, you're raising the children on your own, and in some countries, like that's almost an impossibility. So one of the things that I teach, both in my graduate studies and my undergrad, is impact mapping. So when students come up with a concept, I get them to then impact map that, and looking at marginalized communities or those voices that aren't usually heard. So with your concept or your idea, how does that affect women? And they have to then take all these different players and put them through this impact mapping. And the example that I generally give is, I talk about the taser and how that was sold to many countries around the world, to law enforcement, as a way, as a non-lethal weapon. However, when we and it sounds great on the surface, you think that's great because there'll be less people shot. We can just incapacitate them and then do what we need to do in terms of law enforcement. But what they failed to do, if they had impact map that particular product, would have been to look at, okay, well, what if we put women into this equation? How does this impact women? How does this impact Black people? What is the relationship between Black people and the law enforcement? And what will this do? Yes, it will allow us to not necessarily kill someone, but in whose hands will this product be in? And will that mean, although it's non-lethal, supposedly, will that mean that it's deployed much more quickly? And then you give people less time for compliance. If you're saying stop, don't run, whatever, then you deploy it as quickly as possible. And so I think without that lens over the top of this situation as well, then I think we will continue to leave the vulnerable people out of the equation. And I think they need to be in the equation, absolutely 100%.
I don't have anything to add, except echo that what Angela has done again is put into context the necessity of a focused question. And I could give you my personal reflection on what might happen in 10 years or how I might see it, but it's irrelevant. So that's a professional position that I'm taking. I do have hope. I do think that the impact mapping is a very simple way of getting from how will this change over time, and seeing if the question is called now, that perhaps in 10 years, in 15 years, in 5 years, something like that, there will be certainly a lot of mistakes made, but hopefully in the right trajectory. And to Ziyan's point, like the how and when change will happen, and how and when someone can imagine the distance of time is very variable depending on who's able to consider that. So if I can kind of reflect back, the methods, the analysis, the multi-stakeholder input, and then a framework like impact mapping might help to see into the future, or with multiple futures, as a potential way to get ahead of the problems, or get ahead of the so to kind of box that from theory and general statements, innovation in the tech sector tends to be a lot of fixing something that just happened. So correcting some bad choices for a product. So overcorrecting for that. So taking some time out beforehand, asking the questions that the very challenging questions that you're asking. And thank you for those. To have those in the foundations of thinking carefully before you take a boxed framework or a boxed practice such as futures literacy, and to consider that as one of many approaches to these intractable problems.
Okay, so I think we have covered a lot, and I really thank you for participation. But this is the last question, and this is about imagination and what is its role in anticipation and in futures literacy. I think this would be my last question. So any one of you who wants to address it. Riel Miller had said that we cannot anticipate future without imagination. So how important is it in today's world, especially? Like when earlier we thought that reason was very important, and there were one abuse that was hurled towards us was that you are acting irrational, illogical. Now it seems that we are going to outsource logical analysis to machines. So and at that point, as human being, what would I have that I could offer? Would it be imagination? Would that have a critical role, just as critical a role that reason had during second and third phases of industrialization?
Great question. I think imagination is critical. It feels like something that's critical, at least to my perspective, because without imagining, things tend to continue at a very linear perspective. Like, it's a cliche about Henry Ford and when he invented the automobile. If he were to poll the market, they would have often said a faster horse. But without that imagination to take things further and proceed, to be able to take variables and substitute, combine, add, modify, replace in different ways, that's what often has driven innovation, advancements, and the respective second, third order implications of each of these advancements. Being able to visualize yourself in the future, be able to visualize what your environments could look like, be able to imagine what your role in the future could look like. Imagination is pretty important for those.
Yeah, and then I would add to that. I think without imagination, we wouldn't be sitting here with this technology, being able to be in different countries and converse and share around the world. So I think that's a beautiful piece of imagination. And I also think that when I think back, and I always try and ground myself in aspects of the past, but I think you can't go forward without looking at some of that history. And as I am a settler here in Canada, in Toronto, Canada right now, I really give respect to the Indigenous people and their ways of knowing. And so they have been using imagination and futures thinking for thousands of years. And one of them is called the 7 generations, where they're talking about, okay, the actions I do now, I have to look into that future in 7 generations. What will be the end result of that, or what could be the possible outcomes of what we're planning and doing? So I think we have to give dues to other nations around the world when we talk about futures thinking, and not look at it necessarily as just a sort of Western framework, which I think very often it's considered that. But I think there's lots of value all around the world, in Africa, in Asia, about this concept of futures thinking. And Pupil Bish, who Ziyan mentioned, who's an alumni of the Strategic Foresight program here at OCAD University, she's doing some amazing work on futures thinking in Southeast Asia, so and different communities. So definitely someone you should have on your show next time.
Sure will.
And one interesting thing to add about imagination, just as a closing point from me, is that our imagination is often limited by what we've experienced. And as a test for you and the audience, try and imagine a new color, right? Wow. And I think a big importance here is that importance that we continue to challenge ourselves, try and adopt a growth mindset, and keep exposing ourselves to new things, because that will expand the scope of our imagination and help us build better futures for all.
Yes, Maggie?
I was trying to understand what imagination is, actually. And it's, I think starting with that is a question. The short list that I came up with in this, short period of time from Angela and Ziyan's answer is things like curiosity and wisdom and a willingness to say yes and on top of all of the outputs of imagination. Not to discredit where imagination comes from organically. Imagination can be enhanced by provocative questions like imagine a new color, or imagine cooking spaghetti with orange juice, or it kind of gets at an electrical level that fires new thoughts in the brain. So and excitement and passion and so on. Teaching imagination or understanding imagination is I think a starting point for pulling apart what's cool about it, and what are some of the smaller capsules of imagination that can be flourished within different people because of the different way they think and their different sense of comfort level. So that's my call to action, and I would love to hear your how you understand imagination now or in a future conversation.
Absolutely. We will talk about our theory of imagination, which comes from the philosophers of the West as well as from the East. And they think that imagination is that interface that brings us information from the external world through our senses. And it also brings information from the internal world through emotions. The instincts and the drives, they talk to us through imagination. And the same thing about the external world. So they think that it is a bridge between the external and internal world. So imagination is that powerful for them. And we can definitely talk about it in more detail, maybe later on in some conversation. But I really thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Angela and Ziyan. I really appreciate you taking time out. It was very early in the morning in Canada, I understand. And but still, you guys have done a wonderful job. And we will share it with everybody during the conference. And thank you. Maybe next time we'll meet again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We look forward to next time.
Yes, lovely questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I wish you the best.
Thank you.